the US, you have legalized bribery so that corporations can literally buy politicians.
The Revolution Radio Network.
Montana is going to court.
Greg Gianforte is expected to plead no contest to an assault charge. He's accused of assaulting a reporter from The Guardian on the eve of Montana's special election last month. He won anyway. He's apologized, calling his conduct unprofessional, unacceptable, and unlawful.
Rebuilding America together. This is the Jeff Santos Show.
It's past the hour. I think I might have mentioned that it's coming up at 5:30, the replay of the interview with Thomas Barlow. It'll be at 5 o'clock Eastern, of course, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock Eastern time. I was just talking to our great producer, Bob, who was, of course, filling in for Ron, and this, to me, folks, is why we do this show. To give you an insight to what is happening around the world, but it relates to what's happening here in the United States. And this is why progressive, independent, alternative media is so much needed.
But you became a victim of his whole plan. You got trumped. Yeah, you got trumped. When he gave it to the corporations and they monopolized the nation, and you got trumped. Man, you got pumped.
Well, of course, that's the one and only Mark Taylor-Canfield, great journalist, great musician, of course, based in Seattle, WA, and, of course, writing for the Capitol Hill Times. And, of course, you can hear him here every other Sunday on the Jeff Santos Show. Catch him on Daily Kos as well. MTC, it's great to have you on the program, man, and I am so excited to have you on following our interview with Thomas. That, my friend, is exactly why we are independent, alternative, progressive media members of the same world. Your thoughts, my friend? I know you had a chance to listen to the interview. Great to have you on.
Yeah, great interview, and one of my favorite subjects, of course, freedom of the press. And actually, I just put up a report at my YouTube channel last night on the Comey testimony, and also talked about freedom of the press during that report. So it's been one of my focuses for a long time. And one of the things I wanted to mention is I actually have testified before the Federal Communications Commission on this issue of corporate media consolidation. And there's a group in Seattle called Reclaim the Media that's been really big on this issue for years. And what I did was I brought forth some studies that the FCC had actually commissioned itself. And this was part of my reporting for the Pacific Radio Network. And what I found was that several professors had done some research that was commissioned by the Federal Communications Commission about the negative effects of corporate media consolidation, including its effects on the restrictions for ownership of minorities and women, its negative effects on local news coverage. But the Republicans on the Federal Communications Commission have always been, at least for the last few decades, for corporate media consolidation. So that's why in the United States we have this situation where only a few media companies actually own pretty much everything you watch and listen to. In the radio networks, you've got Clear Channel and Cumulus owning hundreds and hundreds of radio stations across the country. And you've got the major media conglomerates, entertainment media corporations owning most of the news you watch. So we can blame our own Federal Regulatory Commission on policy in the United States where you have such limited ownership of corporate media. And the problem, Jeff, is that when I brought those studies before the FCC, they claimed that they'd never heard of them, even though these were their own studies that they had commissioned. These professors were totally irate that their research had been suppressed by the Federal Communications Commission, and one of them claimed they would never accept a commission from that agency ever again. And it goes to this whole political bias within the political system where you have corporate interests who are running things and who are regulating things. So there were two Democratic commissioners, Democratic Party commissioners, Commissioners Cops and Edelstein, who were for limiting corporate media ownership, were for community-based media, were for low-power and public media. But we had Colin Powell's brother, Michael Powell, as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commissions during this time. So I just wanted to tell you what I'm up against as a journalist. The other issue I have is that I write about issues of press freedom, Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. I write about this all the time, but I find that some major media outlets, whose names I will not mention at this moment, but maybe later, they have actually declined a lot of my articles on this issue. Now, truthout.org, they seem to want to cover this issue and are more than happy to publish my articles. But I have to tell you, Jeff, that even in the so-called independent alternative media in the United States, this is an issue that the editors and publishers do not want to talk about. And that's a shame, because Reporters Without Borders ranks the United States as 43rd in the world in terms of press freedom on their 2017 World Press Freedom Index report. So we got a lot of work to do in this country. And with the recent stories about Ben Jacobs from The Guardian being slammed by Republican candidate for Congress and now member of Congress, Gianforte, I mean, and the prosecutions of journalists like Amy Goodman at Standing Rock, and then Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker Dea Schulzberg facing 45 years in prison on conspiracy charges after covering some of the protests near Standing Rock. We got an issue in this country that editors, publishers, netizens, journalists, bloggers need to face directly. They need to stand up and speak out publicly on this issue. And unfortunately, Jeff, it's just not happening.
Well, I can tell you this, and it is so important for the American people to understand, as we heard with Mr. Barlow and others, that there are other countries that are far, far more advanced in how we do media in this country and what the subject matters that we talk about. You know, it was interesting. I was watching CNN do a recap of the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, and it was the BBC and other British newspapers and British media outlets that were actually looking at the seriousness. And this is in the early 1960s and into the 1970s of the assassination of Kennedy. Very, very few, with the exception maybe of CBS, Dan Rather and Cronkite and others, would do an analysis post-Warren Commission in 63. But you really had to go to outside the United States to get anybody who was questioning, which of course now majority of American people believe that there was a conspiracy. The House Assassinations Committee in the 1970s, labeled it at the feet of the mafia, and so on and so forth. However you believe, whoever was involved, I believe it was connected more to Vietnam and the military-industrial complex. But the fact is, it was the British media that really opened the door, Mark. So there you go. It's been going on for a while.
Yes, and I have to point this out, too, that I am taking an online course from Dan Rather, and he is on fire right now on issues of press freedom. He was on fire right after Donald Trump was elected, saying this is the time for people in the United States to stand up for freedom of the press and freedom of speech.
We're right back with Mark Taylor-Canfield and your calls. It's the Jeff Santos Show, 772-925-8206. We're back in a flash.
Bring it forward.
Voluntarily turned them over not only to the Senate Intelligence Committee, but to the special counsel.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions is set to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee next week. Richard Jordan explains.
In a letter Saturday, Sessions says the Senate Intelligence Committee is the most appropriate forum for questions involving the Russia investigation. He is expected to answer questions Tuesday pertaining to former FBI Director James Comey's testimony. Sessions was originally scheduled to appear before the House and Senate Appropriations Subcommittees on that day. Richard Jordan.
3 U.S. soldiers are dead and another soldier is injured following an inside attack in Afghanistan. Vice President Mike Pence said the details of the attack will be forthcoming.
On my way here, I was informed that U.S. service members were killed and wounded in an attack in Afghanistan. But suffice it to say, when heroes fall, Americans grieve, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families.
Live in beautiful downtown Boston, this is the Jeff Santos Show.
49 minutes past the hour. We're talking with our good friend Mark Taylor-Canfield, known as MTC, to some of you. And, of course, he's a great musician and a great journalist. And we're talking about press freedom and, of course, how this relates to what is happening in terms of covering major stories, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And, of course, you know, covering Donald Trump, as we saw with what was happening in Montana in the race there for Congress, and how a Guardian, great newspaper out of the UK, newspaper was, I should say reporter, was basically manhandled and body slammed to the ground. Outrageous stuff going on. Again, Mark, we'll bring him in. And, Bob, if you can reduce the volume on the inner studio, that would be great. Thank you. Mark, give us a little perspective here about what has been happening. You know, some of the people we've had on this show, people like Greg Palast and others, have had to move away from the United States to do some of the work that they have done. Talk to me about that. Glenn Greenwald's another one. Because this to me is not, as you say, when we were ranked 40-something, this quote-unquote shining city on the hill, that's a disgrace. And we're, you know, in a similar perspective when it comes to human rights as a whole, Amnesty International, when it comes to health care for everyone, we're down there in the middle of the pack, you know, in education. It goes on and on and on. And that, to me, is a disgrace.
Well, your former guest,
thoughts?
you know, described the situation on the national level with what he called legalized bribery, which I thought was, only a Brit would use that term. In the United States, we don't, but perhaps we should, you know, because we always talk about the Citizens United decision. But he's right on that issue. But in terms of Glenn Greenwald and Greg Palast, they are two of my favorite journalists. I would say, you know, Walter Cronkite's autobiography, Life of a Reporter, is sort of, you know, my mainstay. But also I met Greenwald here in Seattle at an ACLU dinner in his honor, and we talked a little bit about this issue. I've talked to Greg Palast about it as well, and both of those reporters have left the United States. Now, Greg has been working with the BBC in the UK, and then you've got Greenwald with The Intercept, and he's down there in Brazil where, you know, they actually had to leave the country. Now, I have decided to stay here and fight it out, and luckily I live in the Northwest and in Seattle. But I have had my own experiences, and also some of the news agencies I've worked with have had experiences. And let me give you a couple examples. When I interviewed Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who refused to lead his troops into Iraq, he was court-martialed, and journalists for the Pacifica Radio Network were subpoenaed at his military trial. So those were one example of how in the United States there is no protection. There is no blanket protection law for journalists that allow them to protect their sources. So you could actually go to jail because you refuse to testify or give information about your confidential source. So that's a problem in the United States. That's a big problem. The other situation is Democracy Watch News is a global news service that I work with. I'm actually vice president of that organization at this point. And we had 2 reporters that were actually physically thrown out of the World Food Prize there in Des Moines, Iowa, because they were accused of being protesters. Well, they had been interviewing protesters, but they were there as journalists doing their job, or at least trying. And by the end of that conference, we had 3 journalists who were ejected, which was, and there was a story in the Des Moines, Iowa Register about it. But, it's another situation where not only are journalists sometimes threatened with arrest, but they're also suffering from lack of access. You've got that. You've got the article that I wrote for Daily Kos when the Bernie Sanders delegate was arrested at Jim McDermott's office. Well, I was also threatened with arrest if I didn't leave the room during that situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it could go time after time, and I think that we really have to also make a case here. And we talked to our good friend Joe Williams about it. But the fact is, Mark, is that, sad that we're talking about this in 2017.
And by the way, Jeff, according to Reporters Without Borders, which is one of the best organizations on this issue, this year in 2017, there are also a lot of journalists who are in prison around the world. So 192 journalists are currently imprisoned, 166 netizens imprisoned, and 10 media assistants are now in prison around the world, according to Reporters Without Borders. And that is probably a partial list because in some of those countries it's impossible to get the information. Last year, Jeff, the Reporters Without Borders ran a sort of satirical media campaign saying 2016, great year for dictatorship. 2016, great year for tyranny. We've seen what's happened in Turkey. And that's another issue that's really raised my ire is that we have, our Secretary of State meeting with the leader of Turkey at a time when they're shutting down news agencies and firing academics because of their political points of view. And just to be clear, when Dave Schultzberg was arrested in North Dakota, when Amy Goodman was arrested, the law enforcement officers, the local law enforcement officers, which is in this case the county law enforcement, did make public statements that they thought that these journalists were practicing biased reporting. So they made it public that they did not like the reporting that these journalists were doing on the Standing Rock water protectors. So that's a political motivation, and that's what
it is. And our good friend Peter just emailed me on the fact that Bradley Manning did time for showing the attack helicopter that killed the Reuters journalist. So you go on and on. Mark, you have done so much great work on this issue. Again, you can follow him on Twitter at Mark Taylor-Canfield. And we will talk about this and Mr. Trump in the coming weeks. Thank you, my man, here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, well, keep up the good work, Jeff, and best of luck to you on your campaign for the City Council in Cambridge.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that very much. We will do our best and hopefully secure a position. Thank you, my man. We will be talking to Frank Watkins. We look back at the 70s, and are we repeating history? Watergate, an outsider in the White House, 1976, following Watergate.
The Revolution Radio Network.
If he's got evidence of collusion, bring it forward. If he's got evidence of corruption, of obstruction, bring it forward.
Joining other Republican colleagues, Utah Senator Mike Lee says he doesn't see anything that amounts to obstruction of justice. Senator Joe Manchin echoed the same sentiments.
We've been looking and showing everything that they possibly have. That has not led to that.
Former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords says it's an incredible honor to have a U.S. warship named after her in Texas during a commissioning ceremony yesterday in Galveston.
We ask so much of you. Despite danger, you say yes. Do you make me proud? You make America proud. I will never forget this day.
Thank you for listening to USA Radio News. Violence this weekend and arrests in several cities as marches against Muslims plays out. Lisa Campbell reports.
They were organized by a group calling itself Act for America. Ruth Mercier was among them.
Sharia law is, the root of it is evil. It's an oppression against women, against women's rights, against freedom.
Samia Hussein was a counter-protester. She leads the Muslim Coalition of Connecticut.
We're here for everyone. And the Act for America has been going around and spreading all these lies and propaganda, getting people divided. In a time like that, we need to come together and be able to tell them that we will not let this happen.
Police are still counting those arrested.
Eastern time. I was just talking to our great producer Bob, who was, of course, filling. This is why progressive, independent, alternative media is so much needed. You saw what the Brits did. They followed online through the internet. Folks in Manchester and Glasgow and London and in Birmingham and the rest of the UK saw what Bernie Sanders was doing. Saw what Melanson was doing in France, and they came out in record numbers, and they said, "Look, we're not gonna just be for austerity light. We're not going to be for a kinder, gentler Miss May."
Your media is owned by oligarchs. Congratulations again.
Thank you, Peter. Go ahead, Thomas.
Great.
You're absolutely spot on, mate. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's another thing that's come out during this election. The media, the press in our country especially, are owned by 5 billionaires. Rupert Murdoch is one of them that you will know from Fox. And,
of course.
And they were so unified in their attacks against Corbyn that actually and the BBC joined in as well, that actually what happened is people started going, look at the Conservative website and then look at the front pages of every paper, including the BBC, and they've copied it word for word. They unified their attacks, but what has happened as well is that, yes, still a lot of people, it's worth remembering, still a lot of people bought those papers, believed those lies. But millions didn't, and millions said, actually, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what the people in the Labour parliamentarians say. We believe that, that society has to change, that we have to take the wealth back from 1% because we created it, and this is going to, it's our wealth, it's our money, right? They had this thing like, oh yeah, the manifesto is great, but where's the money going to come from? A magic money tree? And the answer to that was, we know where the money is because you know where the money is. It's in offshore bank accounts that you've been squirreling it away on. There's a revolving door, and they're all involved. And there's a lot in the Labour Party, like the Democrats. Not quite the same. Again, in the US, you have legalized bribery so that corporations can literally buy politicians, whereas it's a lot smaller here, but there is other ways that they influence them, and certainly Tony Blair is a classic example of a guy who was in bed with big business from the beginning to end. But there's a little
Clinton
less
clone.
of that in the UK.
No doubt. He's a Clinton clone.
Terrible. Yeah. He's a terrible, but this is the death of Blairism in the UK. That's what's happened, because no one can openly be a Blairite. They can't support what he stood for. What's happened over the past 7 weeks has killed that. It was on its knees and now it's finished. And that's what we need to do. We need to stop saying we need to be in bed with these big companies. We need to be on the side of the many, not the few. That was the slogan of the campaign. For the many, not the few. And I thought that's a great example of it. It's on the side of 99%, not the 1%. That's what politics of the future will be, and it will be astoundingly popular, and it will cut through whatever the media try and chuck at it. It will cut through. As long as you talk to people face to face, it will work. That's the lessons from this election.
Thomas Barlow, senior editor, Real Media. What a fantastic interview. We're going to repeat this again coming up at 5:30 Eastern on RevolutionRadioNetwork.com. Thomas, we'll be in touch. This is for you, Manchester's own Smiths, Morrissey Marr.
Yeah.
We'll go to commercial. Thank you much, Thomas. All the best.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
This is the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. Rebuilding America together. Now, here's Jeff.
It's the third and final hour of the Jeff Santos Show, the third and final live hour. Coming to you from the streets of Cambridge. Well, technically inside a building on the streets of Cambridge, but we are on a street in Cambridge. Oh, it's Studio A. It's been a long weekend, folks. Shout out to friends in Dartmouth, Mass. today as they just completed their yard sale, garage sale. My parents involved in that. And shout out to all the good people who participated in that endeavor. We are going again, folks, to repeat the interview with Mr. Barlow at 5 p.m. today. It was a great interview, an informative one, and we're looking forward to having Thomas back on again to discuss the UK, Mr. Corbyn, how it connects to Sanders, and so on and so forth. And it was a great, great interview.
Bring it forward.
Senator Susan Collins says they should be turned over to investigators.
He should voluntarily turn them over not only to the Senate Intelligence Committee, but to the special counsel.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions is set to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee next week. Richard Jordan explains.
In a letter Saturday, Sessions says the Senate Intelligence Committee is the most appropriate forum for questions involving the Russia investigation. He is expected to answer questions Tuesday pertaining to former FBI Director James Comey's testimony. Sessions was originally scheduled to appear before the House and Senate Appropriations Subcommittees on that day. Richard Jordan.
3 U.S. soldiers are dead and another soldier is injured following an inside attack in Afghanistan. Vice President Mike Pence said the details of the attack will be forthcoming.
On my way here, I was informed that U.S. service members were killed and wounded in an attack in Afghanistan. But suffice it to say, when heroes fall, Americans grieve, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families of these American heroes.
Lisa Campbell.
Award season continues tonight as the Best on Broadway is honored. Here's a preview of the Tony Awards.
Yep, the Tony Awards are tonight. Many nominees are breathing a sigh of relief as there's no one overwhelming favorite, as Hamilton was a year ago. Getting the nod this time, Natasha, Pierre, Dear Evan Hansen has 9, and Bette Midler's Hello, Dolly with 10 this time around. Midler says she's surprised to be still standing after 50 years in the game.
I've done a lot of shows. I've been at this for 50 years, and I've never lived through anything like this.
The show hosted by Kevin Spacey for the first time ever tonight on CBS.
Live from the palatial studios at Emerson College in beautiful
But
downtown.
why not? Smoke on the water, fire in the sky. So if we take this to the ultimate degree with Mr. Trump and company, if there is smoke, there must be fire. And if there is fire, someone is going to get burned. That is how I look at it, folks. We'll play some more songs from the 70s coming up in the 3 p.m. Eastern hour. Again, that is 2 p.m. Central, 12 Pacific, and I put together some oldies, and our good friend and producer today, Bob, helped out on that as well. 772-925-8206 is the phone number to join us again. We'll get to your calls in a minute or two, but let me just state where I think we are. You know, I got a chance, like a lot of you, to watch the Comey hearings, and it is pretty much has been explained that Mr. Comey, although a understanding of the Washington world, you pretty much have to if you're going to be FBI director and work in the Department of Justice in that high levels of the department. But he is a Boy Scout. I mean, the guy is, he's close to jolly gosh kind of dude. And I really think that he came across pretty well. Now, some people will debate that, that he led on about, giving his information to the reporter at the through a friend of his at Columbia University, then to give presumably to the New York Times and others. But I really believe that he is pretty much a guy who is willing to do the work in what he thinks is correct for the FBI. If you think back, he was not overwhelmed with the edict that he got at the time from Loretta Lynch on the whole Hillary Clinton email scandal. And so he wanted to make it clear that, he wasn't just going to sort of, call it a matter and let it all go. So he obviously had it. And, of course, there was probably some pressure bubbling up from some of his team. So he had to deal with that. So he had to deal with a lot of right-wing crazies within the FBI who were trying to get that information out, presumably maybe even trying to help Trump and all that. And then, of course, now he has a situation where Trump wants him to basically say, oh, no, this Flynn guy, not a big deal, and do it again. And he's really saying, look, I got a job to do, and there's a lot of smoke, and therefore, if there's a lot of smoke, then there must be fire. And I'm not going to be the one that gets burned. So that's what he did. He released the information. Now we know. And if Trump can do all this sort of, jive talking he wants to do. He is the ultimate excuse maker. And, he wants to bully himself. And now he has this attorney, that comes out and says, oh, he's totally innocent. And Comey's the one that's leaking information and all this stuff. It wasn't classified, so he didn't really leak anything. But this is where we are, folks. And I really believe that the next couple of years are going to be this drip, drip, drip situation that really isn't going to change. And, he wants to get along with, the Republicans who are basically, hell-bent on Mr. Ryan and Mr. McConnell. They only want to basically take the money from their campaign donors, the Koch brothers and all those others, in big oil, big banks, military defense industry, and they just want to do the business of those folks. They could care less about the average American, white, black, or brown. They could care less about anybody that doesn't put a ton of money into their campaign coffers. So, unfortunately, there are some Democrats that have gone along with that as well. I believe that is less of the party that is just going along with the Republicans. There's some that still sort of put the finger up in the air. But all that being said, the Democratic Party now has an opportunity to take the issues that Trump is running on, this outrageous health care plan, the AHCA. They have to basically call it what it is, a pig. And a pig that will hurt Americans, working poor, those who are on Medicaid right now, all of that. So that has to be called out. This infrastructure plan, Senator Sanders talked about it the other day. A shout out to all of our friends at Our Revolution, both here in Massachusetts and across the country. The fact is this. Sanders came out, I didn't see many others, in a statement calling this a bunch of BS. My words, not his, but it's what it is. I mean, this is a giveaway to private industry. He doesn't really go into rail, which you need to do. He doesn't really go into broadband in rural America, which you need to have, particularly for his constituency, rural, conservative, white men and women. That was a lot of his bread and butter. And he doesn't talk about any of that. He just talks about the idea of roads and bridges, which everyone talks about. But again, you're not doing anything to reduce the carbon footprint because who's on the road? Not everybody has an electric vehicle. But we're going to spend the next half an hour with our great friend from the Cardinal Nation, Reverend Jesse Jackson's right-hand man since the late 60s. He is, of course, part of the Herb Boyd, Jerry Austin world in which we get expertise from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and, of course, this century, too. The former great baseball star, the Cardinals fan. It's time for us to go to St. Louis and talk to Mr. Frank Watkins. Because Saturday nights, all right, with Elton John. Happy Sunday, Frank. How are you?
Terrific. You included a lot for somebody who's only 30 years old.
Oh, yeah. We know. We know. Well, you are a young American. And, we went from Elton John to David Bowie here because we're looking back at the 1970s. You were a very young American at that point. And we're going to talk about that time period because these songs were from 1973 to 1976. And that was a very interesting time in our nation's history. Of course, the beginning of Watergate, ending up with the election of Jimmy Carter. And all of this is something that you followed as part of Reverend Jackson's team and, of course, as a political activist in that time period. And I wonder, as I often do when we look backwards to the 60s and 70s and so forth, the 80s, and are we repeating history? You know, we have this Trump-Comey hearing, obstruction of justice. All of these things were, of course, front and center with Nixon. And once again, potentially could be with Mr. Trump. And, are we going to have a president in 2020 that no one heard about, just like we did with Jimmy Carter, unknown, one-term peanut farmer governor from Georgia? So I want to get your thoughts here. But if you could take us back, Frank, to what that was like. And when, McGovern loses by a landslide, there's, what are we going to do in the Democratic Party? And then begins Watergate. And, we played Saturday Night's All Right by Elton John to open the doors here. And, of course, Saturday Night wasn't all right for Archibald Cox and the rest of the folks that were massacred by Mr. Nixon and the quote-unquote Saturday Night Massacre. Talk to me a little bit, set the stage, what it was like back then, for Democrats, for progressives like yourself, and maybe compare it a little bit to where we are today.
Well, that's a tall order.
Yeah, but you can do it, Frank.
but there are some potential, at least, parallels. In other words, Nixon was not impeached because he ordered a break-in of Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, and the tapes came out where he was ordering, I believe it was the CIA to order the Justice Department to stop the investigation of the Watergate break-in. So it was the cover-up that eventually led to Nixon's demise. He was not formally impeached, but he would have been, and in all likelihood would have been convicted in the Senate. And so he resigned. There is the potential, at least, we don't have all the facts yet, those are still being investigated, that Trump could be putting himself in a position to be found guilty of obstruction of justice in light of what's going on, in the current situation. Not that he would be impeached because of any Russian connection, but that he is potentially, at least, not telling the truth and covering up various things that may have gone on. So there's at least that potential parallel between the two. What was going on, of course, in the early 1970s, as you indicated, if you remember, there was what was known as the police riot that occurred at the Democratic Convention in 1968, because the rules were so unfair, and out of that convention grew the McGovern rules, which reformed to some degree the way delegates were selected to the convention, taking the nomination out of backroom, cigar-filled, smoke-filled rooms to nominate presidents and putting it more in the laps of the American people in a more democratic fashion. We were still in kind of the afterglow of the civil rights movement. Dr. King leading the movement, but of course he and Robert Kennedy were assassinated about 3 months apart, April 4th, and I believe it was June the 5th of 1968.
Right.
So we were kind of in the afterglow of, a 64 Civil Rights Act, a 65 Voting Rights Act, an Open Housing Act in 1968, a war on poverty that was launched, that was kind of being sabotaged with the war in Vietnam. As Dr. King said, the bombs that were being dropped in Vietnam were exploding in America's urban centers because there were disturbances in Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and other cities around the nation. So we were, as I mentioned, kind of in the afterglow of the civil rights movement. We were at the tail end of the Vietnam War. Again, Nixon had lied in 1968 when he was originally elected that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. He had no such plan, and it lingered on for several more years, in fact, into his second term before there was a formal ending of that tragedy and that immoral engagement by the United States government. Then came Watergate. Again, it wasn't the Watergate break-in per se that led to Nixon's demise, but the cover-up that followed it.
Sure.
And then Carter was elected in 76. There was also, at one level, it was a combination of factors, not only Watergate, but the ab scam, where members of Congress were caught on video.
That's right, New Jersey, the great movie remake that went on with a number of great actors in that film of a couple of years ago that were done, and Miss Adams, and there was a tremendous amount of people, Mr. Bradley, and so on. So yes, so Abscam goes on, I believe, in 1975, I believe.
Yeah. So it was the combination of all those factors that, at one level, led to the crisis of cynicism, I guess you would say, and lack of faith in the government. It was around that time that the Pentagon Papers had been released that showed that the American government, had been lying to us about what was going on in Vietnam. So at one level, you could trace back to the early 70s or in the 70s that, we kind of lost faith in politics, in our elected officials, and began doubting whether what the government was telling us was true or not. And now, of course, that's come to full fruition when almost all of our institutions are under attack and not believable. I mean, people don't believe the press. They don't believe the government. They don't believe in politics. And Trump may have been the result of that they just wanted a strong man to come along to say, I alone can solve it. And so they went for the okie doke. They were conned by a con man, and now we're living with the consequences of that, of what actually occurred in the early 70s is coming to fruition in 2017.
It certainly is. Talking to Frank Watkins here on the Jeff Santos Show. Take a couple of quick phone calls for our good friend Frank. Let's go back to Chicago and talk to Rudy, who remembers that time very well, the mid-1970s. Rudy, I know that you had some thoughts on what was going on with Nixon and how it relates to Mr. Trump and where we are in 2017.
Yeah, I recall that era. I was working for a major airline in Fairfield in customer service, and I was an agent, and I remember talking to the senators that were coming through to go to various places in regard to the investigations and hearings. And Scoop Jackson was one of the senators that I had a bet, and there was another young fella with him, and he said, this is supposed to be Russia, all that Nixon was doing, and that they would have to do something about it, and they did. So it was kind of a close-up thing that occasion that I had with the people, the lawmakers, so to speak. So I remember that part of it, and and those hearings, a lot of the hearings back then were on regular network television.
Yeah. Which was the only thing around. There was no cable back in the 1970s. Yeah.
Yeah, but
that
I
was
mean,
free networks.
But yeah, right. But even though there's cable today, you should still have it on network.
I agree.
The airwaves belong to the people. I don't think so. And it just is remarkable where we've gone as far as journalism is concerned. And there isn't any real journalism except on your program with guests like Frank Watkins. So
thank you.
It's a shame. I don't know if we'll ever return to the media we used to have, but we ought to. And since one again is informing the American people of what's going on in your government. They call it leaks. It's a leak to know what your government is doing. Yeah. And it's incredible to put it in that perspective.
It's completely outrageous. Go ahead, Frank.
In that regard, I don't think we should become totally cynical. In fact, at one level, it's been the press that has been one of the highlights of this particular period. They have continued to reveal, things that Trump and his administration is trying to hide. Without the press, we wouldn't be knowing many of the things that we do know.
Yeah, I think you can also distinguish between the print press and the television press, too. I mean, where CBS and Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather were doing great things 30 years ago, not so much the case. I mean, CNN throws some things up there, but are we really getting the news? It's really been the Times, to a lesser extent the Washington Post, and a lot of alternative media that has been able to do it, right, Frank? Because I think there's a vast difference between print and television.
The print has been really the stars. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times have kind of distinguished themselves. As you indicated, there are other outlets that have also broken stories, but clearly the Post and the Times will probably wind up with some awards.
Well, I would say that that's what the press, the understanding I think everyone's had is the press is supposed to inform the public, But I tell you one thing, I don't think they would have been as informative about what's going on now if Trump didn't attack them. They got him elected.
I agree with you, Rudy. I agree with you.
Stabs the press in the back, constantly saying bad things about the press. And I don't think if he didn't have this tirade against the press, that they would have reported as much as they have.
And I think there's certainly a degree of truth in that, and especially television and the cable networks assume a great responsibility for electing Donald Trump. I mean, they gave him, what was it estimated, a couple $1 billion, I believe, of free advertising by covering his rallies and so forth in an unprecedented manner and mostly in an uncritical manner.
They were saying on some of the programs during the day and so forth, how is it that he doesn't even have to show up in the studio? They call him on the phone.
Yeah, in his pajamas.
He gets coverage
they didn't even call him. He would call them, and they'd put him on the air. On the other hand, of course, the hearing that took place this week with Comey, 19 million people tuned into the hearing, which was also kind of unprecedented.
Well, particularly when you have it at every bar in Washington D.C. and around the country, as a O.J. Simpson-like activity of watching, this situation. I mean, if Trump testified, it probably would have been, 100 million people. But I do believe.
Somebody mentioned, I think it was Lindsey Graham mentioned this morning, bring Trump and Comey together before the hearing, and you'd have unprecedented, ratings.
Yeah, that's for sure. Rudy, great points as usual.
Thank you.
I think I think, Frank, that, looking back at that time period, we had, I think, better journalism. We just did a whole thing with both Mark Taylor-Canfield on press freedom and how many American journalists, have been beat up. We saw what happened to the Guardian journalist covering the congressional election in Montana. They just body slammed by the Republican candidate. There are problems here, but there have been some good reporters for the Times. That being said, the Americans, I think, are ranked 40th in terms of good journalism, from Reporters Without Borders as well. So, but I want to connect you to another thing before we go, and I want to also hear from a good friend John in Minneapolis in a minute. And that is, Frank, that was there in your mind in the mid-1970s a thought that somebody in Washington could not be the nominee of the party, that you needed somebody outside, and Carter was the guy? I mean, because, for instance, if Bernie Sanders, to me,